Hello and welcome once again to Kitaabi Baatein. I'm Abhishek, also known as Books Wale Bhaiya. My guest today is author and computer decision support scientist Somik Raha, with whom I'll be talking about his book, Invaluable. And let me tell you, this book is actually, I would say, many books in one. This is about taking decisions. This is about decision support, decision sciences. This is quite a bit of philosophy, poetry. So it's many books in one, as this is the way I look at it. And congratulations, Somik, first of all, for the book. And I must say, a very, very well researched and well written book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. So, before we start talking about a brief introduction about Somik, so Somik Raha grew up in India in a family where free thinking was encouraged, along with an engagement in deep conversations. Somik worked as a decision analyst and as a bachelor in computer sciences from Bangalore Institute of Technology and a master's and PhD from the Department of Management Science and Engineering at Stanford University. Somik lives with wife and two children in the Bay Area, where he continues to explore the fascinating intersections between technology, philosophy, and the human experience. So, as Samik, I was telling to my family that I'm interviewing you today, and after knowing about your qualifications, they were happy कि काफी पढ़े लिखे आदमी का interview हो रहा है आज. As a PhD in Stanford is definitely, it means a lot. But coming to your book, Somik, so as I see it, your book deals about decision making, decision support, values. One thing I want to start with, invaluable, achieving clarity on value. So now value is something which means many things to many people. And as you have written a book on it, what value means for you?
That's a very good question. Usually, when people hear the word value, they often think about cultural norms like integrity and so on, how you treat people. Those are very important, but that's not what I mean. A second group of people, more mathematicians, might think value is something you're optimizing, so they get into metrics very quickly.
Yes.
When I use the word value, I mean what is important to you personally, Abhishek, or whoever is reading the book, and that is intricately connected to who you want to be. And that is the foundation for any decision we will make, because if we cannot answer the question who we want to be, then we cannot answer the further question, which is what do we want. And if we cannot answer that question, then we cannot make any decisions, because then every decision looks, it's like the alternatives look the same. You cannot choose. So clarity on who we want to be is foundational, and when you
Right.
make decisions from that space, it becomes very special.
That's true. So you talk about value, or I can say, in a sense, it is about deciding what we want to do in life, in personal life, in professional life. So in a way, we can say it deals with that. How do you see your background in software and decision support, wherein you talk about say optimization, maximization of profit, and things forecasting, which softwares you can say decision support are used for. How did that background help you in understanding and eventually writing a book about value?
It's a very good question. So there are many people who have written about values, and what's different about my work is that this takes a very strong focus on metrics, and there's a reason for it. So, you people often this is a pretty big problem in our day and time, that people have a very good job, they have all the external markers in society that they're succeeding, and yet inside people feel very hollow. And
Yes.
so what do you do when you feel that way? Well, then you either find a hobby or you go for a retreat, and but you do something to leave the work and find meaning. But then you may have had a wonderful retreat somewhere, but then Monday morning comes, you are meeting the same group of people where you were feeling
Absolutely.
hollow, and you're facing the same metrics by which you were being judged. And again, you feel, maybe in many ways you maybe even feel worse now. So it is very important for me to look at this with the existing tools of work and the existing materialistic constructs. So this book is a very counterculture book. This is not a book which says, oh, there are good spiritual ideas in the world, let's bring it to our work. It's the opposite. It says, look, there are materialistic constructs we've created, namely accounting. Our world runs with more than accounting. What is the root of accounting? It's counting.
Counting,
We
yes.
1 2 3 4, like, we have built this whole world with counting. If we do not know how to count, we cannot have our computers, our systems, nothing. Okay, how do I go deep into that construct which I use every day, and you cannot challenge it because that is how business works.
Yes.
With that construct, I'm going to take a deep dive and see how philosophical it really is. And to my surprise, I find it is extremely philosophical. So all the insights that come in the book, they come from that materialism construct of counting. And we find that deep it is deep, inspiring, and full of meaning if we look at it in that way. So it gives you an interesting offer that you can change the relationship you have with your work through the existing constructs if you are willing to dive deep into this.
Right. So as you said, you can find value if you're willing to deep dive into this. So my
Hmm.
next question is actually we about this only. We live in a world which is obsessed
Hmm.
with numbers.
Yeah.
Everything is today measured,
Yeah.
whether it's your salary, it's your
Yeah.
productivity, everything. So
Yeah.
doing good in a job is not enough. It's measured. You know how many hours you put in, what was your billing rate, what revenue you generated. Stock market guys are obsessed with what's that EPS, in that particular quarter. Consulting firms pay a lot to those people who can measure everything, and that's what consulting as a business is known for. So
Hmm.
in an era which is dominated with numbers,
Hmm.
data, and in an era where data is known as a new oil, how
Hmm.
do you think anyone can reconcile with numbers and the fact that you can find your value purpose through the numbers?
Well, that's the whole book, right? So
Yeah.
let me start by going to the very foundation of it. So our current number system, which it's variously called the Hindu-Arabic numerals or the Indo-Arabic numerals. What differentiates it from what Europe knew how to do, and that is the introduction of zero.
Yes.
Europe did not have zero. The poor Romans who had to write very large numbers, you needed consultants to add them up, and they resisted zero for a very long time until I think in the last 1,000 years, I think maybe 1400, 1500. That's when it really started coming in. So what's special about the zero? Where did this come from? And chapter zero in my book, my first chapter is not one; it's called zero, and it gets into that. And what I found growing up in India was this comes from a very ancient philosophical poem which for various reasons people use it mostly in religious spaces. But if you look at it as a mathematician or a computer scientist, it says purnamadaha purnamidam purnat purnamudachyate. That is whole, this is whole, from that whole comes this whole. Purnasya purnamadaya purnameva vashishyate. When you take that whole away from this whole, what remains is whole. Sounds very spiritual, mystical, but ask yourself a simple question: what symbol has every culture come up with for representing wholeness? And it's usually a circle. And the
Yes.
circle is also the symbol for nothing, right? So if you parameterize the word whole and replace it with nothing, then this poem still has meaning. It says, from nothing comes nothing. And that is the basis of physics. If you take that out, you cannot get physics, current physics. Then you look at the last line. When you take nothing away from nothing, what remains is nothing. And nothing, another word for it is zero. When you take zero away from zero, what remains is zero. So that is the first poetic representation of the equation zero minus zero equal to zero. And it is
Mm.
coming from such a deep reflection of an experience of wholeness. And the ancient people, they felt that nothing and everything were two sides of the same coin. Okay. Now that still feels a little bit mystical. So let's make it even more materialistic in a sense of what do you learn in the classroom? Well, it turns out that zero is what you get when you add every single number you can think of, positive and negative. If you miss
Right.
out a
Right.
single number, you cannot get zero. So then
True.
I often ask children, hey, so is zero full or is it empty? And then they will respond to me saying, well, we used to think it was empty, but now we realize it's also full. And
Also
that's
true.
with today's mathematics. That's what children can appreciate. But it's astonishing to me that we don't take a moment to be surprised and to wonder, like, who came up with this? This is crazy stuff, right? How
Absolutely.
did you think about this? And we use it. This is at the very foundation of our counting, that numbers are an invitation to connect with an experience of being empty and being full, right? So it starts there, and then I build on that. and look at the purpose of our work, whether you're in a profit or a non-profit. The purpose is, if you look at even these labels, for profit and non-profit, these are accounting labels. These are not states of being, right? And great business people knew this. So there's a quote there in the book from Henry Ford, who said that he's a captain of American industry, the founder of Ford, and
Right.
he said that a business must run into profit or it'll die. But if it solely runs for profit, then too it must die, for it has lost
Mhm.
the purpose for its existence.
Right.
Okay? And what a powerful thing to say, right? So we are
Very
here
true.
for a purpose, right? The money matters, so we can get to the purpose. So that's an order of things. Like if you get this wrong, you kind of put the cart before the horse. And it's true
Yes.
for non-profit also, right? We talk about impact in that space. So you'll find that people often beat themselves up with measuring profit or measuring impact. And I say something very controversial in the book, that if it truly matters to you, you can't actually measure it. Okay? I'll give you a simple example and then I'll stop there. So we brush our teeth every day. Okay? So we use the metric two, like how many times did you brush? Have you done it twice? No, then go brush. So the number two is not equal to dental health, which is what you're really after. In fact,
Right.
you cannot measure dental health. You can say how many cavities somebody has. If two people have the same number of cavities, then you may need x rays to differentiate. But then it gets complicated very fast. But we have not found something as simple as the count of how many times you've brushed to create the value of dental health. So, what the key connection between the count and value is the action. If you do not brush, you do not get dental health. So,
True.
counting is super important because it drives action. And a good metric is one that is clear and drives action, and a useful metric is one that drives action towards the value that you want. And that is a very powerful distinction. Okay, I have more distinctions. We can keep going, but let me
Right.
pause here.
That's some definite food for thought. And so you talked about philosophy, especially Indian philosophy or Hindu
Hmm.
philosophy in your book, and you are talking this someone who has great experience in decision sciences and softwares and all. How much you think your thinking overall is shaped by your reliance on Indian philosophy?
I think this book is a mix of Western and Eastern philosophy.
Yes.
So it's, my upbringing is definitely Indian. So you'll see that imprint in there. But the rebellion in the book is, I'm not going to use Indian philosophy to find answers. I'm using it to raise questions. So every
Right.
chapter, and not in every chapter, in other chapters, you'll see Western philosophy as well. But there's a philosophical element that raises an interesting question, but the answer comes from materialism, counting.
Right.
Okay. So that's the counterculture aspect. And I think as you go deeper into the book, you'll find a very big contribution from Western philosophers, in particular Robert Hartman, who was a gentleman who fled Nazi Germany before it fully became Nazi Germany because he saw what was happening. And he dedicated his life to the inquiry of how do you count value in such a way that you will never devalue human life again. And that becomes a cornerstone of the book. And in some sense, I take a point of departure as well from his work, but that's a pretty important contribution in counting from Western philosophy.
That's true. So again, talking about this thing as you mentioned about finding value and all. Again, coming to the point while you have raised this point that how in a world which is driven with the driven by data and numbers, we're
Hmm.
talking about finding value. But do you think when we look at implementing it, now I can understand those who read your book would definitely be fascinated by this idea, and he or
Hmm.
she would definitely be interested in exploring it. But at a more practical level, do you think, say, organizations which are more obsessed with numbers or the media
Yeah.
or people like that, do you think a change in this psyche, this mindset can actually be brought there?
Yeah, it can. If even the basic questions people fail to answer. So let me point to chapter two, which is input, output, and numinous metrics.
Right.
That's got some profound philosophical questions. So let me put it very simply. If you're in a company that says, "Hey, you must make money," okay, you want profit. The problem is nobody knows how to get it. Otherwise, they would have already gotten it. Okay. So the reason why work gets stressful is nobody knows how. Hey, I want profit. How? right?
uh,
So our profit, think of it as an output metric, that if everything is going well, it will give you a signal that things are going well. But the input is what creates the output, the drive, that driving of productive action, right? So think of it as dental health is the output, but the input is how many times did you brush. So you have a theory that if you brush, you will get to dental health. So generally in every organization, profit, for profit or non-profit, people have a theory of change, and that theory is, if I take this action, it will create value. Then you ask yourself, what metrics will help me create more of that action? And those are your input metrics, and they are very different from the output metrics. So if you were to just stop listening right here and you go back to your workplace, and tomorrow you say, what is driving productive action, let me do more of that, you will find you're creating very different companies. Then
yes,
maybe yelling and stressing people out is not creating value. Well, let me not
right.
do that. Right?
Very true.
But serving our customers in amazing ways or new ways, I've got an insight, what if we did this? Then it becomes a very creative exploration. And
True.
so the metrics that you pick will either shape or constrain your creativity, and that's a very big practical takeaway from the book.
No, no, that's very true. I think I agree with your point of, because the problem is we are more focused on the outcomes, on the final numbers, how do they look like,
Hmm.
but we somewhat, don't focus on what, gets into arriving at that number, and can fix, that perhaps many problems can actually be solved. But yeah, I think your book does provide that strong understanding of what we are discussing, and let's hope it gets implemented, and perhaps we need
Thank
it
you.
now more than ever, because we are getting again, as I said, into a world which is kind of solely focused on numbers and data.
Well,
So
let me give you a metaphor which can be very helpful. What is your favorite fruit, Abhishek?
bananas.
Okay, bananas. So just by thinking banana, banana, you're not going to get banana. If you want good bananas, you have to think about the seed, the soil, when do you plant it, season, water, sunshine, and then after you've done everything you possibly can, you have to give up meaning give up to nature, that nature will do its thing, right?
Right.
And it may or may not happen, hopefully it will happen, and sometime in the future you will get your bananas. So the bananas are the outputs. Okay, everybody wants those outputs, but how do you get them? By focusing on the inputs. And so the garden
Right.
metaphor makes it very relatable, that hey, oh, I should be thinking about the seed and the soil.
Right.
And if you what if you thought of organizations not in the industrial era mindset, but as a garden mindset, that how do you nurture this space so beautiful fruits come out, changes the entire work.
Very true. This reminds me of a chapter in one of Swami Vivekananda's book, which wherein he talked about the means and the resources. So the end and the resources. So he said we get so much obsessed and fascinated with the end goal that we lose track of what are the means and resources required for it, and we tend to lose sight of it, and no wonder we don't reach our goal, and we get fascinated. Just because we get fascinated, lose track of what's required. And he said
Hmm.
this is one of the finest lessons I have learned in my life. So what you are saying again, yeah, I do see that a connection between philosophy and what you are saying. So coming back to another question on philosophy,
Hmm.
I think your book, reading a book, made me realize that there are a lot many things in our philosophy, and for that matter in Western philosophy as well, which is kind of very practical. And philosophy is not something which should be linked with those gray haired people who didn't do anything and they teach you philosophy and all. And when anyone starts saying things in detail, we say कि यार ये अपनी philosophy जरा side पे रख. But I think people are becoming aware of what all is there in philosophy. And if I take the case of India, yes, there's a growing awareness about Indian philosophy. Especially, I see people talking of things like Advait Vedanta and all, which is a very core, you can say, essence of
Hmm.
Hindu philosophy, for example. So yeah, I think books like these, again, the messages like they also help in blurring those distinctions between philosophy and the real world, something which is very much needed. So coming to the book, I wanted to know, I know it's a long drawn affair, it took you lot many years to write and all, but wanted to get a bit more idea on how the
Hmm.
idea of writing this book came about, and why it actually took you this long to write this book.
Yeah, it took if you count, so the PhD years were 4 years, and after that took 12 years. And this story is in the preface that I'm, I gave a talk at the end of my PhD research in, or maybe after, a year after. And then this was at the celebration of our department, and every area was invited. And that talk I had practiced um, quite a bit, but I forgot to take out. There are these automatic timers in PowerPoint when I was practicing to keep it under 6 minutes. I forgot to take it out. And so the slides kept moving on their own. And it was, from my perspective, a terrible presentation. So I was feeling bummed about it. And then a few days later, I met this professor in our department who had seen the talk. And she said, "That was a thought provoking talk. I want to talk to you." And she then, Professor Tina Seelig, and she then inspired me. She said, "You should write a book." And my first question was, "Well, what would I call this book?" And as if that was the hardest part. And she said, "Oh, I have a name for you. You would call it Invaluable." And so that's how the name came, Invaluable. And the subtitle, Achieving Clarity on Value, is the title of my PhD dissertation. And the reason it took so long was because I think I had four manuscripts before this, and I was writing quite expansively in all kinds of ways. And I kept getting stuck. Publishers were like, "Oh, there are many books in this," and it's for various reasons. And I went back to my professor, my PhD advisor, and he loved whatever I was writing. And we had a good laugh over it. I said, "Look, you find the book valuable, but I'm not able to convince publishers." And then he tells me, "Somik, some of the greatest American classics, they only became classics after the author died." Oh, okay, that's so that gave me a lot of perspective. Like, okay, first of all, detached from the goal of getting that kind of outcome. So okay, so but then he said, "I'm noticing something unique about your book. You're talking about counting. I taught you decision analysis. I didn't teach you counting. So you have something different here, which is interesting." And then I realized, if my book is about uniqueness, I need to engage with my uniqueness and what is the unique message in this book. And then this last manuscript, I deliberately set a few patterns that, and they're also in the preface, like how did I write this? And it was about finding just that uniqueness and focusing on it. So as a result, you have all these counterculture patterns, that it's not going to be a book that preaches spirituality. It's the opposite. It finds depth in materialism. And then it's also going to have a sandwich pattern, which is, it'll start with a philosophical puzzle, find the answer in counting constructs, but then it'll end with something that makes you feel, because that's another myth that people have. Counting will disconnect you from your feelings. And Hartman also had that perspective, the German philosopher. And he felt that it reduces, count metrics reduce the richness of experience. But what I found is, sometimes miraculously, counting can break through and connect to your spirit. And that's those metrics that that achieve that are what I call numinous metrics, with an N. And so this book is about how do you find them, and give examples and stories of those.
That's true, and I think, yeah. So as we mentioned, this book tries to bridge the gap between two concepts which are, we can say, are believed to be at polar opposites, at
Hmm.
the opposite ends, because either you can be either you can be obsessed with numbers as everyone is, or you can talk about philosophical things at all. You can look at more of a, if you talk in terms of research, it's more either the qualitative thing or the quantitative things. But I think your book does raises this very important topic, that there is a lot of convergence between the two, and only if we can start thinking in those terms. Because what happens is that they are these quant guys, and I think you can very well understand, appreciate that, you yourself being an engineer, the quant people who look at things only in terms of numbers, practically everything in terms of numbers, and then there are qual guys who look at everything beyond numbers. But yeah, there's definite convergence, and again, as I mentioned, the book like these helps breaking those barriers. So that is one of the key takeaways. What other takeaways do you think your book has, like this, like the one we talked about? What other interesting things you are there in the book?
So let me give a little bit of color on, well, there are a couple others. So I've looked at values from the science perspective as well. So so in order to appreciate that, I have to give you a little bit of the framework of Hartman, and then how do I make a leap from there. So Hartman's framework had three dimensions of value.
Yes.
And the foundational idea is that you can define intrinsic values as life itself. Okay, these are axioms, so principles. You just say this is defined, there's no justification needed. Extrinsic values are those that have a space-time reality. There exist as visible behaviors, physical reality is there, and they're a means to an end, defined as a means to an end. The third is systemic values, and systemic values are constructs. They're completely artificial. So anything you count, any metric is systemic, and it's the value of rule fulfillment. Like when I'm brushing my teeth, the number two, the rule that how many times did you brush? Is it two? That's a systemic value. When you fulfill it, the system is fulfilled. But what is it driving? It's driving the action to brush. That's an extrinsic value.
Yes.
Why? Because that creates dental health. And why does dental health matter? It matters because I matter. That's intrinsic value. My life matters. So that those are the three dimensions. But then you can also experience these three values, and the psychological affect can be broken in the same three dimensions. Intrinsic valuation is when you cannot separate the value from who you are. Extrinsic is when you can separate it. Okay, like like life itself, like I can't separate the value of the people I love from who I am. But if you look at extrinsic, this table that I have in front of me, it has extrinsic value. I'm not emotionally attached to it. It is useful because it's giving me an easy way to talk to you. Okay, systemic is a number, like I'm least connected to it. It's the most objective in its experience. So now that you have this framework, you can look at major decisions that people have taken, like say the Nazi era, when they looked at a whole group of human beings, they said we are racially superior, and that was a systemic construct of some superiority, and they were applying it to life itself in what is an intrinsic value. So when you value human life as a number, you have taken intrinsic value and valued it systemically. Systemic
Yes.
valuation of intrinsic value. The moment you are aware, you're like, oh, that sounds odd. And then you can ask yourself, do I want to be doing it? Right? And the other way is also possible. Like you can take something systemic and value it intrinsically. So for instance, people get crazy about promotions. Oh, I need this promotion. Otherwise, I feel like I'm a loser. So you have now devalued your own life, and what you have raised above is this systemic construct called a promotion, a title, which doesn't actually exist other than in our heads, right?
Yes.
And that's another big mistake people make. So this framework allows you to avoid these mistakes by having a clear conversation, and it's very powerful because you can also go, like if you think about politics or you think about religion, they're full of systemic constructs, and people, when they're on two sides of the spectrum, they don't have a way of engaging with each other and usually become very judgmental. This gives you a language in which, without judgment, you can sit down with a friend who's on the opposite end of the spectrum and have this conversation on which of these is systemic, what is intrinsic, what's extrinsic, and do you really mean this? And you'll find that you have a way of diving deep, even though you may not fully agree with that. And so there are wonderful stories there. In fact, a lot of this work opened up because I was in conversation with somebody whose politics I totally disagreed with, and that showed me like how to do non-judgmental listening. So if anything, this book's messaging is not that I need to tell you about values. It is really that I need to shut up and listen deeply to you so I can discover what is already there. So that's a very, very
Yes.
big part of the book because everybody carries some depth. And it's a book on listening technology, if you will. Like how do we listen to each other? How do we listen to ourselves? Okay. And then I will make a point of departure on these metrics that break through, right? Systemic values, Hartman stops with systemic is bad, right? You're systemic, like in the sense that if it's using it more than driving action, it's to judge others or to experience it as part of yourself, real big problem. Agreed. And yet there are times, like the example I give is the US Marines, when they went to Afghanistan, the leader of that organization, Lieutenant General Richard P. Mills, he reflected on how do you judge the success of the war, and he looked at metrics like how many enemies did you kill. That's problematic because the whole country, if they don't like you, how many are
Yes.
you going to kill? Okay, then do you get from one place to another safely? That was a problematic metric. And he arrived at a very strange and interesting metric. He felt that if people feel safe, then they'll send their boys to school. But if they really, really feel safe, that's when they'll send their girls. So if you
Yes.
can count how many girls are going to school, you will know if you're achieving your objective of bringing peace. And so he literally had his soldiers count how many children, how many girls are going to school. And so that to me is a numinous metric, not something you would expect from a soldier, right? It
Yes.
connects you to life, it brings a reverence for life, and it makes you feel something. That's now I'm not commenting on the politics of the war and all the other associated things, but just the fact that here is a person who's doing his duty, and is the duty is to bear arms and destroy property or life. And if we can respect life, that is a lesson to the rest of us that we can surely find ways of respecting life in our work, right?
Absolutely.
So there are many examples like this. I can keep going, but let me pause here.
Right. So I think that was a very important thing you talked about, like the number of girls being sent to school. That is again, this is an example where in layman's language you can say the qualitative and the quantitative aspects meet, and you are actually defining it through a number. So as you said, it's not other than materialism, but it's actually material things, the numbers that actually count. And in fact, so I was coming to this question. In fact, this is the problem with philosophy. As I said, many people understand it to be only for the the boring elderly people, whereas wherein this has something with a lot of insights and very very
Uh-huh.
practical insights. We have made philosophy the image of it such that it's the boring thing and those the idle people talk about it. So but that is something very profound, I will say. And again, as I've read a bit of Indian philosophy, so or Hindu philosophy, and that's what I have always found the insights to be very practical and not something which is over the top, and not something which if you're reading it just to impress others, that say I'm a very intelligent chap and I'm reading this. That is something a very practical thing. So we talked about this human aspect. We talked about as you said, what I notice is that many times what you're talking about, it also depends on how much we know about ourselves. That's how I put it. And when you said you need to have conversations, I think it is important to know yourself and important to know the other person without any prejudices and biases. We should actually understand the aspect, understand what the person is saying, then form an opinion or maybe even a bias. But it happens the other way around. We start with those biases, with those cognitions in our mind,
Mm,
and when we get something and we think, okay, mujhe pata hi tha, that's how he will he or
mm,
she will react, that's what he will say. And this again brings to whether it's achieving clarity on value or whatever. I think knowing yourself is very critical. This self awareness, and this again reminds me of Swami Vivekananda. And in fact, to be honest, I found many insights related to his teachings. And he said that our minds have become externalized. We know everything happening outside, we don't know what is inside us. And in this age of social media, wherein people spend half of their day browsing through reels,
mm.
we have opinions on things like whether Israel Palestine should go to war or not, whether Russia Ukraine what they are doing,
Yeah,
whether PM Modi did the right thing or not. But how much
yeah.
do we know ourselves? That aspect which very importantly and significantly affect our lives, that is missing.
Yeah,
And
very well put. Yeah.
yeah, and I did see, so as I said at the beginning, this is I would say these are many books in one that offer some very profound insight. So other than philosophy, I noticed this poetry thing also. Just wanted to ask, how did that came in?
Yeah.
How did you decide to fit that in?
So let me first acknowledge that since you brought up Swami Vivekananda, a big influence in my life, and in fact, I think one of the chapters you will find a very famous chapter story that Swami Vivekananda popularized, which comes from the Mahabharata, that of the butcher,
Yes,
and how the butcher gives a lesson to the monk on clarity of on values, and that's a very counterculture. So this book is full of anti-heroes or counterculture stories. So I'll just point that out. And then, since you asked about poetry, another big influence in my life is Tagore
oh,
and
cool.
Kabir. So Tagore comes in the book a couple times. And what
Yes,
I've just noticed, I've also worked with Western teachers who have had a poetic influence on me. And generally, I find that poetry is able to go where prose cannot go. In a few short lines, you can
yes,
communicate so much. So each chapter is actually summarized in two poetic lines, and And that gives you the full essence of the chapter. If you understand that, you've got the essence of the chapter. And by the time you end the book, all the lines, they become a full poem. And for instance, chapter 0, right? They said they said emptiness and fullness were opposite ends of the spectrum. Meanwhile, emptiness found itself full and fullness found itself empty.
Okay.
Right? Service was this is chapter 1. Service was hard work, they said, and joy the result. Meanwhile, hard work showed up as joy and service was the result. So people make service such a heavy thing. But what if it is actually driven by joy? That's a key premise of the book. Chapter 2 is on causality. We talked about input output metrics and numinous metrics. Time is the cause of all things, they said. But in that moment when time stopped the other day, the timeless cause knocked. And this is not mystical at all. Like there are times when we feel so inspired by our work, we've stopped keeping track of time. It's just that simple,
Yes.
right? And we're connected to ourselves, to what matters to us. Chapter 3, we're talking about counting, how it'll break connection to the spirit. This is where Hartman shows up. Counting will break connection to spirit, they warned. Imagine the surprise when spirit instead broke through counting. That's what we've been talking about. Then
Yes.
right, and then chapter 4 is when 4, 5, and 6 is about a framework that gets you to know yourself better. And so I've got three vectors, which is heart, habit, and head. And heart is your emotional energy, habit is your superpower, which is also your curse at the same time, and head is your intellectual energy. So the heart summary is this: look, they said, at the narrow river of love that humans are. They didn't see that the narrow river connected to the ocean and turned humans into gods. Okay? That's the essence. Like, what is that one
Yeah.
value that other person who I may disagree with stands for? That they're the god of this value. That anytime somebody asks, comes in the door and knocks, whatever is their situation, whatever their trouble, their river of generosity will always overflow. What is that value?
Absolutely.
And suppose it was there, if you were to find it, you will respect that person in a way that has not been possible before. Then next one, chapter 5, is about the habit. Look, they said, at your stubborn habit that refuses to die. Little did they know that this was your superpower waiting for context. So we're busy in the game of changing others or changing ourselves. But what if there is something so fundamental you cannot change, but you find a context where that habit is a really big asset? So when you're constructing your work context, you want to be very mindful about this, that your heart is respected and your habit is not getting in the way. So if there is a person who wants to stay with one thing for a long period of time, and that's very different from a person who loves jumping around. So you could give coaching to the jumping around person that, hey, you need to focus. Or you could put that person in a consulting company and that person would be a superstar, right?
Right.
So those are the kinds of things that if you can construct that work context where these two are respected, you have created an amazing life experience. And chapter 6 is the head. Look, they said, you got to get out of your head. Little did they know that your head was the sanctuary for your heart and habit. So people often, when they get into meditation or things like that, they often start devaluing the intellectual side. But the intellectual side is an important side. When you are talking to each other, you are using the intellect. You cannot take it out. And that is how you construct your livelihood. So that is the one thing that you can shape with your hard work. Heart and habit in the book, it's a process of discovery. Head is not a discovery. Head is a work of your active effort. Yeah. Then when you get all three together, chapter 7 is a chapter on strategy. How do you use it for decision making? They said, learn strategy to come out ahead. Strangely, when the self was found, strategy came out true. So then the next chapter gets into science, and in particular neuroscience. Because what happened was, I found as we were doing these mappings, I've done many mappings with many people. When we find their core values, the heart, habit, and head, some some interesting feelings would emerge. Like I would feel very inspired, and so would the other person, because they are finding something by which they can respect themselves. And so there's something happening, and I felt, oh, I wish I could put myself and the other person in an MRI machine and, you know,
Right.
scan the brain and see what's happening. Then I started learning about this area, and I found MRI machines are not the instrument of inquiry. It's actually skin conductance, and those are very cheap. You can wire yourself up and see what's happening. And the idea comes from lie detector tests. You know, if you watched a Hollywood movie or even Bollywood these days, you'll find that interrogation, they will connect you to a polygraph. And polygraph is
Yes.
just checking skin conductance, that when you feel nervous, you sweat a little bit more. It's not detectable by the eye, but the device can pick it up. So it's mostly used for negative purposes. But I thought, why not use it for positive purposes and see when I'm feeling inspired, can I detect? And so this chapter
Right.
shows data and and talks about that, the science. It comes from the work of Professor Antonio Damasio and his colleagues. So the summary of this is, they said, don't let your feelings confuse you. Little did they realize that confusion arose when you could not feel. So such an important thing about feelings, right?
Right.
And then, and in fact, one thing I will say is, women often, they see the data and when presented, it's like, you needed data to show us that feelings are real. And there's
Right.
often a gender response, and men are like, oh, this is amazing. It's like, no, we knew this
Yes.
all along.
True. True. Very
And
true.
then the last chapter, it ends with infinity, starts with zero, ends with infinity. What makes distinctions a valid representation of I? They asked. Little did they fathom that I am the source of validity. That whatever validity we have in our life for any construct, it's coming from our life force. And it's valid
Yes.
because we are giving it validity. And that gives immense responsibility and power.
This was definitely most illuminating, and I think it was wonderful talking to you, Somik, and all those who will be watching this on YouTube. I think this is, I would like to say, this is one book I very strongly recommend. This is philosophy, decision making, as I said, it's many things in one. One of the very, profound books I have read. One of my favorites of this year, and I strongly urge to everyone to read this. This will help you think in a very different way about your life, your careers, about practically everything. So none of this is over the top. None of this it has philosophy, but it is not something you cannot use in your life. In fact, this is something you should actually be using in your life.
Thank you. I'll also mention one thing. I'll be remiss if I don't talk about the warning at the back of the book.
Oh yes.
It says this book is dangerous. You might stop comparing yourself to others. Financial wealth may no longer be your primary marker of success. You might count value very differently. You might even start enjoying your work. So, with that warning,
And I would like to
yeah,
add, what this may actually appear to be warning to many people because we are tuned to think in certain ways. So when says, you might stop comparing yourself to others, well, this is what we do day in and day out. So yes, when someone talks something which is different from what we usually do, that appears to be dangerous, but trust me, that is the idea of this book, is to think, to be able to think differently. And this is what the book teaches, how exactly do you do that. So what appears to be a warning can actually be game changing or life changing for many people. Great,
thank you so
Swami. It
much,
was,
Abhishek.
yeah, it
Thank
was
you.
wonderful talking to you, and all the best for your future books. And do hope that you would be writing many books in the future.
Thank you, Abhishek.